She was 8 years old. She had 47 welts on her back. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. And when the mob came with torches and guns, she walked right past the grown men, turned her back to the crowd, and showed them every single mark. No words, no tears, just the truth. And that truth doors broke an entire town wide open. This channel tells the stories the West was truly built on, not just guns and glory, but love between fathers and daughters, the courage of ordinary people, compassion that crosses every boundary, and the quiet heroism of those who simply refuse to give up on each other. Sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the most powerful truth. Like this story, share it with someone raising a strong child, and subscribe so you never miss the next one.
When Caleb asked if her uncle was the one who hurt her, the little girl just curled into a ball, shaking like a leaf in a high wind. That was all the answer he needed. As he gently cleaned her wounds, he felt a flicker of the man he was before his own family was taken from him. Emmy flinched with every touch, expecting more pain, but she let him tend to her. When he was done, she pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her little pocket and handed it to him. It was a letter from her daddy, Samuel. His words spoke from beyond the grave, laying it all out plain as day. He knew his own brother Darius was a snake in deep debt, with his greedy eyes set on the ranch. Samuel had a gut feeling his death wouldn't be no accident. So he'd made a secret will, locked away good and safe, naming Caleb as Emmy's guardian. He begged Caleb to save his little girl, just like Caleb had saved him from a flash flood all those years ago. He wrote, "Save her, Caleb, and maybe you'll save yourself too." Just as Caleb finished reading, he heard the sound of horses outside. Emmy's face went white. Peeking out, Caleb saw two riders pull up. The town marshal, and right there beside him, as big as you please, was Darius Cole. And hanging from Darius's belt was that same silver-capped whip. There was no mistaking it. Caleb looked from the whiskey bottle on his workbench to the terrified child huddled in the corner. He had a choice to make right then and there. He could hand her over and crawl back into his misery, or he could stand up and fight. He walked to the door, not to give her up, but to meet them head-on. He stepped outside into the cold, the letter still in his hand. "Marshal," Caleb said, his voice steady as a rock, "Darius won't be taking her. Seems I'm her legal guardian." He handed the letter over. The marshal read it, his face getting harder with every single line. When he finally looked up at Darius, you could see the law in his eyes. The will was found right where Samuel said it would be. Darius was arrested on the spot, his whole wicked plan ruined. That day, Caleb Dawson did more than just save a little girl's life. He found his own again, proving that the best parts of us never really die. They are just lying dormant, waiting for a good enough reason to come on back. Darius tried to put on a smooth voice. "The girl is troubled. She makes up stories." Caleb's voice came out low and cold. "I know how she got those marks on her back." Darius flinched. His hand went right to the riding crop at his belt. "That is called discipline," he snapped back. "She did not tell me a thing," Caleb said, his eyes fixed hard on the silver cap of the crop. "She did not have to. I can see the pattern the braided leather left. It matches the one hanging from your belt right now." Darius's face twitched. He looked from Caleb to the marshal, who was now staring right at the riding crop, too. "Let me see her," Caleb said. "Let me hear her say she wants to go with you." Darius stepped in close, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey. "That ranch is 12,200 acres with a Mustang herd and an Army contract worth $15,000 a year. You think I'm going to let a drunk and a child stop me?" Caleb's reply was quiet. "I think you already killed your brother for it." The air went still as a tomb. Marshal Briggs stepped between them, his hand gripping his pistol. "That is enough. Both of you stand down." He looked at Caleb with hard eyes. "I have known you for 15 years, Caleb. But I have also watched you drink yourself into a ghost. A man that deep in grief sometimes sees things that are not there." "So you think I did that to her?" Caleb asked. I think I have legal papers on one side and your word on the other. I need more than that. The marshal straightened up. I will give you 10 days. That is the law in a custody dispute. Get a doctor, get a lawyer, and build your case. Darius exploded. 10 days? I'm given the law 10 days to work, Briggs said flatly. On day 11, if you have nothing solid, I come back and do my job. He mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Darius stood there in the cold, staring at Caleb with the dead eyes of a cornered animal. Samuel thought being a good man was enough, he whispered. He was wrong. After Darius rode off, Caleb turned to see little Emmy pressed against the wall, trying her best to just disappear. He barred the door and looked at the terrified child, waiting to see if the monster was truly gone. In a quiet voice, he told her, "You are staying here." Emmy's legs gave out and she slid to the floor, shaking but past the point of tears. Emmy then did something that changed everything. She pointed to the whiskey bottle on his workbench, then to Caleb, and slowly shook her head. The message was crystal clear. I need you to be sober. Without a word, Caleb took that bottle, walked to the back door, and poured every last drop out into the snow. He put the empty bottle on a shelf as a reminder of the promise he had just made. Caleb told her, "You can sleep in the back room. The door locks from the inside." As she went, the little girl held up 10 fingers. 10 days. He gave a nod. He had a dead man's last wish, $9, and a whole town that thought he was just a drunk. He had 10 days to stop a monster named Darius Cole, and the odds were mighty long. This is a story about how one broken man and one brave little girl stood up against impossible odds, because doing the right thing is always worth the fight. Surviving 7 years with a hole in your heart was also impossible. He listened to her steady breathing, a sound of pure trust he had not earned yet. He had 10 days to find that will, hire a lawyer, and face down a man who had already killed for that land. For the first time in 2,555 days, Caleb began to make a plan, leaving the whiskey bottle to gather dust on the shelf. When Emmy came out the next morning, her one good eye went right to the whiskey bottle. "It is going to stay empty," Caleb promised her. The tension in her small face eased a little, but when he mentioned a doctor, pure terror flooded her eyes. "He will tell," she whispered. "Everyone tells Uncle Darius." Caleb promised her, "Hosea Crane is not scared of your uncle. He is a good man." The little 8-year-old girl knew all about risk. For 5 long months, every mistake she made meant another scar on her back. A sudden knock at the door sent her flat against the wall, bracing for a blow. But it was just old Doc Hosea Crane. "Marshal Briggs sent me," the doctor said. When he saw Emmy, his expression turned to stone. "Come here, child," he said, his voice now quiet and kind. "Let old Doc Crane have a look." She shuffled toward him, a battle of fear and trust in every step. "I will not do a thing without asking first," he promised gently. When she pulled her dress down to show him her back, a grim silence fell over the room. With hands steady from 30 years of hard medicine, he cleaned and bandaged each wound, his jaw clenched tight. "No broken bones," he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "But these infections are serious." "When did you last have a real meal, child?" he asked. She held up 3 fingers. 3 days. The doctor's mouth set in a grim line. He turned to Caleb and said in a low, angry voice, "These marks are from that braided leather whip Darius Cole carries. I am documenting everything. This is a medical report that will stand up in court." Then the doctor confessed that he knew Darius had murdered her father, but was blackmailed into silence. "I kept quiet to protect myself," Crane said, his voice heavy with shame. "And because of it, this little girl suffered." He looked straight at Emmy and said, "I am so sorry." To his surprise, she reached out and patted his hand twice. The simple act of grace made the old doctor turn away, blinking hard. "Move fast, Caleb," he warned as he left. "Darius is already poisoning this town against you. Get that will to a lawyer before he gets a mob together." After he left, Emmy whispered, "He cried. The doctor." Just then, another knock came. It was Nettie Hargrove, whose own husband died in a suspicious accident at one of Cole's lumber yards. She brought a basket with food, clothes, and warm boots. Then she pulled out a small book wrapped in oilskin. "I found this hidden in Samuel's old coat," she said. It was Samuel Cole's journal. Nettie showed up and got straight to the point. "Heard you had Samuel Cole's girl here. Figured she needed things." Her tough face, worn down by a hard life, softened the moment she laid eyes on Emmy. Her 12-year-old son, Willie, stepped up and shyly offered Emmy a shiny red apple. Emmy stared at it, then at him, and finally took a big bite. Then, for the first time, Emmy spoke, not to an adult, but to the boy. "What kind of dog?" she asked. Willie grinned and told her all about his hound. Emmy quietly told him about her cat, Copper. When Willie asked what happened to him, her face went blank, and she just took another bite of the apple. The boy was smart enough to change the subject. Nettie pulled Caleb aside. "You know who you are up against," she said in a low voice. "Darius Cole has owned this town for 2 years. That is how my Ernest died." She explained she had stayed quiet to protect her boy, but she was done being quiet now. Caleb told her the will was hidden at the ranch, and he had to go get it that night. "I will stay with her," Nettie declared. "And I have got a shotgun. I know how to use it." She agreed that Willie could stay too, since he was the only one Emmy would talk to. With just $9 to his name, Caleb gathered his tools. All that mattered now was keeping that little girl safe. She ate like a starving animal while Willie just smiled and gave her more food. By afternoon, Emmy was in a clean blue dress. She still jumped at loud noises, but she was talking in small sentences to Willie about animals. As the sun went down, Caleb put on his dark coat. Emmy watched him with sharp eyes. She knew he was leaving. She pointed to the door and then to herself. "No," Caleb said flatly. A stubborn look crossed her face. She pointed to herself again and whispered, "Third hook," telling him a secret about the barn that he needed to know. "It is dangerous," he argued. She just pulled her collar aside, showing him the dark line of a fresh welt. "All right, stay close," Caleb finally said. Needy snapped her shotgun shut. "You bring her back safe, you hear me? It is a terrible thing to make a child walk back into the place that broke them, but 8-year-old Emmy did just that, walking 15 miles in the cold dark next to a man she barely knew. She was the bravest person Caleb had ever met. They walked toward the ranch under a moonless sky, and she never once complained. After 2 long hours, her small, cold fingers took hold of Caleb's hand. The simple act nearly brought him to his knees, taking him straight back to the memory of his own daughter, Abigail. But Emmy's hand was alive and trusting, and she needed him to keep going. Caleb Dawson pushed the pain down, wrapped his fingers around hers, and kept moving forward into the night. A dead man's last wish was waiting for them. Emmy pointed out the lone guard at the barn, a lazy fella named Virgil. It was their one shot. Caleb popped a back door lock, the noise loud as a gunshot. When Virgil came to check, Caleb moved fast, and one punch laid the man out cold on the hay-strewn floor. They tied Virgil up, and Emmy showed Caleb an old saddle in the tack room. Just like her daddy's letter said, Caleb found a hidden seam and pulled out a folded paper. It was the real will, the one that proved everything. But there was more. Emmy pulled out her father's journal. It was a map of murder detailing how Darius had threatened and killed his way across the territory. The last entry was a gut punch saying if he died, it was Darius's doing. Back at his shop, Caleb's friend Nettie was waiting with a shotgun. She looked at the papers. This was proof, but Darius had the town in his pocket. Caleb had a hard 80-mile ride to Cheyenne ahead of him to find a lawyer. He looked at little Emmy, asleep with her dog, Biscuit. Before he left, she made him promise 2 things. No more whiskey, and that he would come back. He swore on her daddy's memory he would. And the little girl hugged him for the first time. In Cheyenne, the lawyer's office was locked up tight. Caleb found Phineas Ward holed up in a hotel room, hiding from Darius's men who had threatened him. The man looked like a ghost who had given up all hope. Caleb told him about Emmy and showed him the will and the journal. He said all they needed was a lawyer with enough sand to do what was right. A fire lit in Ward's eyes. They raced to the clerk's office and filed every last document minutes before it closed. When Caleb and the lawyer rode back into town, Darius and 8 men were there, fixing to burn the place down. As one of them drew a gun on Emmy, Caleb threw himself in front of her, taking a bullet in the shoulder to keep his promise. Emmy was awake before he left, and she pointed a small finger at the whiskey bottle on his bench. "Promise," she said, her one good eye fixed on his. It was the first thing she ever asked of him. "I promise," Caleb said. "Not a drop. And I will come back through that door." Then the little girl wrapped her arms around his neck. Caleb hadn't been hugged in 7 long years, and for a moment he just froze before holding her gently. 2 days later, Caleb and the lawyer, Phineas Ward, rode back into town. Nettie met them at the door with a shotgun across her lap and a fresh blast in the door frame. "Darius came last night with 8 men," she said. "He was fixin' to burn the place down with the girl inside." Just then, Darius returned. But this time, Caleb stood in his way. And when a man drew on Emmy, Caleb took the bullet in his shoulder to shield her. That's the story of Caleb Dawson. At 57 years old, he was riding into a bitter winter with nothing but a promise to a little girl to keep him warm. A monster named Darius Cole was counting down the days until he could steal the girl's inheritance. This story is about how keeping one promise can save a life. If you have ever had something worth fighting for, you will know what I mean. Caleb finally made it to Cheyenne, a city that did not know or care about his troubles. He found the lawyer's office, but it was locked up tight. A fella next door said some rough-looking men had run Phineas Ward off 2 months ago. He pointed Caleb toward the Plainsman Hotel, saying Ward was holed up in room 12. The hotel clerk was a sour man, but the life-or-death look in Caleb's eyes made him slide a key across the counter without a word. Caleb knocked on the door to room 12. A tired voice told him to go away, but Caleb said he was sent by Samuel Cole. The door cracked open, revealing a man who looked like a ghost. "Samuel is dead," Phineas Ward whispered. Caleb looked him square in the eye. "I know, but his daughter, Emmy, is alive, and her uncle Darius has been treating her something awful." Realization dawned on Ward's face. "You're the carpenter," he said. "I am," Caleb replied. "And I have the will right here." "I also have Samuel's journal," Caleb went on, his voice firm. "And it proves Darius murdered his own brother for this land." He told Ward all he needed was a lawyer with enough grit to make it right. Ward confessed that Darius's men had threatened him, so he ran. "You were scared," Caleb said, not unkindly. "But this document makes you Emmy's legal guardian. It makes every single thing Darius has done a crime." For a long moment, Ward stood there, trapped between his fear and his duty. Then he straightened his shoulders and opened the door all the way. He told Caleb they had 90 minutes before the clerk's office closed. They hurried through the streets, 2 men on a desperate mission. When they burst in, Ward was a new man. A lawyer's fire burned in his eyes as he cited the law, forcing the clerk to accept their emergency filing. With only minutes to spare, Ward filed every document: the will, a doctor's report on Emmy's injuries, and Samuel's journal. The clerk stamped each page, making it official. Outside, Ward made a decision. He was done running. He told Caleb he was riding back with him to Black Hollow to face whatever came next. He would not fail that little girl again. But they did not have 3 days. A wire from Doc Crane was waiting. It said Darius had come for Emmy with 8 men. He was run off for now, but he was fixing to come back. In 10 minutes, Caleb was on his horse, deaf to any pleas for a plan. All that mattered was the little girl who trusted him. He rode for 16 long hours, arriving in Black Hollow more dead than alive. But seeing Nettie on that porch with a rifle told him the fight was just getting started. As Caleb lay bleeding on the frozen dirt, Phineas Ward stepped up. "It is over, Darius," the lawyer said. "Your brother Samuel wrote it all down, every crime. And your own hired man is ready to talk." Just like that, Darius Cole's world fell apart. They took him away in cuffs. Emmy knelt by Caleb, tears finally streaming down her face. "You jumped in front of a bullet for me," she whispered. "Told you," Caleb rasped. "I keep my promises." At the ranch that was now hers, they found her cat, Copper, in the barn. As she held that cat, Caleb watched and felt something he had not felt in his whole life. He felt like he was home. She gave him a hard look. "You promised," she said. He looked like he had been rode hard. "Feel worse than I look," Caleb admitted. "But I am here." The lawyer, Ward, stepped in, his face falling when he saw the girl's bruises. He knelt down. "Miss Cole, I am Phineas Ward. I wrote your daddy's will, and I should have been here 5 months ago. I'm sorry." He took a breath. "But that will is now with the governor. In 72 hours, your uncle will not be able to touch you." Emmy stared at him. "Papa trusted you," she said. "Do not make him wrong." Later, Nettie stood watch by the window with her shotgun. "We might not have that long," she said. "Darius has been in the saloon all morning, buying drinks and spreading poison." Caleb's jaw clenched. "What kind?" Nettie sighed. "The kind that says you're a dangerous man. And he is just a concerned uncle. He has about 20 men all worked up." "He told them the 10 days are up," Nettie added. "Says the marshal has to take her." Ward shook his head. "The local judge is Darius's man. All we can do is hold on." And if the mob gets here first, the question hung in the air. "I am staying," Doc Crane said, his voice firm. "And me," Nettie added, chambering around. From the floor, her 12-year-old son, Willie, spoke up. "I am staying too." A look of pure terror and pride crossed Nettie's face. "Lord, help us all," she whispered. Emmy, who had been quiet as a stone, finally spoke to Caleb. "Mr. Dawson, if they come, do not let him take me back alive." The room went silent. Caleb knelt in front of her, his voice low. "Listen to me. Nobody is taking you anywhere. I made you a promise, and I am not stopping now." Her one good eye searched his face. "What if you cannot stop them?" "Then I will die in that doorway. But the law is coming, Emmy. We just have to hold on till it gets here." They came at sunset. 23 men carrying torches and guns filled the street. Darius Cole stood out front with his hired muscle and a reluctant Marshal Briggs. "Dawson," Darius bellowed, "your time is up. Hand over the girl." Caleb stepped onto the porch, his old revolver in his hand. "You are just a carpenter, Dawson," Darius sneered. Caleb's voice was quiet, but it carried. "I can stand against you. That is enough." Marshal Briggs stepped forward. "Caleb, I have a warrant." Caleb stood his ground. "Did you look at the date on those papers Darius gave you?" Briggs frowned. "The date?" "His guardianship petition was filed October 3rd, Caleb's voice rang out for the crowd. 2 weeks after her daddy died. But Samuel Cole's will naming me guardian was filed proper on April 1st, 5 months before. His will beats your paper, Darius." "That is a bald-faced lie," Darius barked. "One more day is all I'm asking," Caleb said, calm as a Sunday morning. "Let the governor see the real will. If he sides with you, I will hand her over myself. If not, you are going to prison." Darius turned on the marshal. "Serve your warrant, now." The marshal did not move. "1 day is not much to ask." That sent Darius over the edge. "That is not what I am paying you for." Caleb's voice cut through the silence. "He is paying for all of it. The judge, the papers, and the silence in this town." Doc Crane stepped onto the porch holding a report. Samuel Cole did not just fall from a horse. He was struck down from behind. The doctor's voice turned heavy. "And his daughter has 47 welts on her back. 3 were made by the silver-capped whip I see on your belt, Mr. Cole." He held up the papers. "It is all documented." The crowd began to murmur, finally seeing the truth. Then the other stories started coming out. a barn that burned too fast, a dozen little tragedies that always ended with Darius Cole owning more land. He was losing the crowd and he knew it. He started yelling about liars, his voice getting thin until a small voice cut through the noise. Enough! It was little Emmy. The 8-year-old girl walked right past Caleb and down the steps into the middle of all those angry men. She stood there facing the crowd. Then she turned her back to them and pulled down the collar of her dress. The torchlight showed them everything. It was a terrible map of cruelty for the whole town to see. The crowd went stone silent. A big fella named Henderson pushed forward. He took off his own heavy coat and wrapped it gently around her small shoulders. "We are so sorry, child," he choked out. "We should have seen it." Darius started blustering again about the law. "A judge you paid," the marshal said, his voice cold. Just then, a lawyer stepped out of the shadows. "The girl's father filed a proper will 5 months ago. Your papers, Mr. Cole, are worthless." In that moment, Darius Cole stood all alone. The men he had paid were melting back into the night. "This is not over," he shrieked. Caleb looked at him, his face set like stone. "Oh, it is over." And that is when the man fell away, leaving only a cornered animal. Darius whipped a pistol from his coat, aiming it right at Emmy. Caleb did not even think. He launched himself off the porch, covering her with his own body. A shot exploded and fire tore through his shoulder. But a second shot followed right after. It was the marshal. Darius went down screaming. The fight was done. Caleb just managed to ask, "Emmy, are you hurt?" Her muffled voice came from beneath him. "No?" Caleb tried to push himself up, but his body would not cooperate. Crane was already kneeling over him, putting his weight on the wound. "It went clean through," Crane said. "But you will live, you stubborn old mule." Emmy was right there, her small hand gripping his, tears finally streaming down her face. "You took a bullet for me," she whispered. "Told you I keep my promises," Caleb managed to say, just as the marshal walked a handcuffed Darius right past them. "You cannot prove a thing," Darius sneered, though his voice was empty. Ward stepped into the light. "We already have. Your own brother documented every crooked deal you ever made." As they hauled Darius off, the crowd parted in a dead quiet that was louder than any shout. Back inside, Crane got to work on Caleb's shoulder, with Emmy still holding tight to his hand. "No bone was hit," Crane finally said. "You will be sore, but you will heal." Nettie was already there, helping with hot water, a woman who always knew what needed to be done. Have you ever seen a wrong get made right before your own eyes? This here is a story about just that. It is about a good man, just about buried by his own sorrows, and a tough little girl who stood up to injustice and won. It proves that a promise is a thing worth keeping, no matter what it costs. After the fight, they waited. Round midnight, the telegraph boy showed up. The territorial governor had made his choice. Samuel Cole's will was good as gold. Caleb Dawson was now Emmeline Rose Cole's legal guardian. Her uncle Darius and his petition were worthless. Emmy looked at Caleb, laid out and bleeding, and whispered, "We won." And through all that hurt, he finally smiled for the first time in 7 long years. "Yeah, little bit," he breathed out. "We surely did." It took 3 whole days before Doc Crane would let Caleb get up. The bullet went clean through, but losing that much blood is serious business. Every morning, Emmy would march right over with coffee, her dog Biscuit trotting behind her, and just sit with him. She was a quiet comfort. "You got shot," she said one morning, plain as day. "Not for me," she added. And the way she said it meant the whole world. For the first time, Caleb saw she was starting to look like a kid again. Just an 8-year-old girl with her feet barely touching the floor. She told him the marshal had stopped by. "They caught the man who messed with Papa's wagon," she said, her voice stronger now. "Said Uncle Darius paid him $50. She then said, "They told me Darius is going to trial for everything, for what happened to Papa and Mama." Caleb just watched her. "He might hang," he said softly. Emmy was quiet for a good long while, just stroking her dog. "I thought I'd feel something," she finally said. "Happy or mad, but I just feel tired. Caleb nodded his head. That happens when you've been feeling too much for too long. Your insides need a rest. On the fourth day, Caleb walked out of the docks, his arm in a sling and his side aching something fierce. Ward, the lawyer, was waiting for him. "We need to talk about the ranch," he said. They all gathered back at Caleb's shop, sitting around the very same workbench where this all started. Ward laid out the papers. The governor's office confirmed it. "Caleb, you are her guardian. The ranch, the herd, all of it goes into a trust for Emmy until she turns 18. And you are in charge of it all." The lawyer kept going. "As for Darius, his money is all frozen. The court is looking into every crooked deal he ever made. Some folks he cheated might even get their land back." Caleb had to ask, "What about this shop?" He pointed to the past due notice from the bank for $175. Ward gave a small smile. "Funny thing. Turns out Darius owned a big piece of that bank. To avoid any ties to a murderer, the board decided to forgive your debt." Just like that, the weight was gone. The shop was his. But Caleb just shook his head. "I do not need the shop," he said, looking right at Emmy. "I need the ranch, if that is all right by you." The little girl looked back at him, sizing him up one last time. Then she gave a small nod. "It is your home, too," she said. "Papa wanted it that way." 2 weeks later, his arm still in that sling, Caleb and Emmy went to the Cole Ranch. They were finally going home. Finally. Stepping through that ranch house door felt like coming home after 7 long years away. Everything was just as Samuel had left it. Emmy wandered through the quiet rooms, then stopped. "Copper," she said, turning to Caleb. "My cat. The guards would not let me bring him." They found the orange cat 2 days later, living up in the hayloft. When Emmy called his name, Copper came right on down and curled up in her arms. She just held him and cried with pure relief. They started putting their lives back together. Good people came to help, folks who owed Samuel's memory a debt of hard work. Nettie and her boy Willie came out to the ranch, filling the house with life again. Nettie taught Emmy how to run a household, while the kids taught each other about roping and riding, their laughter filling the valley. Caleb started teaching Emmy carpentry. "Wood does not forgive sloppy work," he would tell her. She would get frustrated, but she would always sand the piece down and try again. Her first birdhouse was crooked, but she hung it on the porch anyway. "A bird just needs a home," she declared, "and it does not care if the house is crooked." Then she looked at Caleb and gave him a real smile, the first one he had ever truly seen. 6 months later, Caleb rode up to the cemetery overlooking the valley. He stood before the graves of his wife and daughter. "I met someone," he said to the wind. "She is a little girl, just turned 9. I built her a bookshelf for her birthday." Caleb put his good hand on his wife Ruth's headstone. He spoke softly. "Her name is Emmy, Samuel Cole's little girl. His own brother took everything from him and hurt that child for 5 long months. When she showed up at my door in a snowstorm, barefoot and bleeding, something I thought was dead and gone woke up inside me." He glanced at his daughter Abigail's small stone. "Emmy is not a replacement. Nobody could ever replace you two. But she needed help. And for the first time in 7 years, I said yes. I poured out all my whiskey that night." Standing up, at 57 years old, his body ached something awful. "I could not save you," he whispered. "I was 40 yards away and I could not do a thing. I spent 7 years dying from it. But I saved her. I saved Emmy. I know it does not fix what is broken, but it is something real." He put his hat on, touched both stones one last time, and promised to bring Emmy up sometime. "I love you both," he said. "But I am done dying, Ruth. It is time to live again." Back at the ranch, he saw Emmy doing her schoolwork at the kitchen table. After seeing to his horse, he walked inside, his mind finally quiet. Emmy had a respect for sorrow that you only get from knowing it firsthand. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table in the same chair her father used to sit in. Her mother's chair stayed empty. Some places are meant to be honored, not filled. "I cannot figure this one out," Emmy said, pushing a piece of paper toward him. It was long division. He tried his best. but the numbers would not work. "You cannot do it either, can you?" she said with a little smile. "I am a carpenter," he admitted. "I measure things. I do not divide them. Papa could do numbers in his head." "Your papa was a smarter man than me," Caleb said. A small laugh passed between them, the quiet kind shared by two people who had survived something awful. Later that night, Emmy closed her book. "I am going to bed now." She stopped at the door. "Mr. Dawson? I used to have nightmares every single night. I have not had one in 3 weeks." Caleb put his paper down. "That is good, Emmy. Now I dream about Mama and Papa. Good dreams." And she looked at the empty chair. "Sometimes you are there with us, with your crooked hand and your bad coffee. And it feels right, like it is supposed to be." Caleb could not trust himself to speak. "Good night, Mr. Dawson. Good night, Emmy." He listened to her footsteps go upstairs, and the house settled into that safe and special quiet. He moved through the house, checking the locks, doing the little things a man does when he has something precious to protect. He paused at the front door, looking at a horseshoe they had made together. She had carefully carved words into the wood below it. Built on promise, kept by love. He touched the smooth wood, then stepped outside to look at the stars. They were the same stars he had stared at for 7 empty years. But from that porch, they looked different. "Thank you, Samuel," Caleb thought into the night, "for trusting a broken man with your whole world." He walked past Emmy's room, and the door was open just a crack. She was not afraid anymore. He saw her sleeping peacefully, one hand hanging off the bed. He went to his own room, which had been her parents'. It was finally starting to feel like home, a place where a new family born from 2 broken ones was learning how to heal. Emmy had insisted he take her parents' room, saying her papa would want someone in there who deserved it. That night, Caleb sat on the bed and looked at his hands. One was strong and scarred from work. The other was crooked from saving a child. He was living in another man's house and raising another man's daughter, but for the first time in a long while, he was keeping his promises. Fixing things on a 1,200-acre ranch was hard work. It was an ordinary life, the kind he thought he had lost for good. But it was a life with purpose, a reason to put his boots on in the morning. It was a different house and a different family, but it was filled with the same warmth. That night, Caleb Dawson closed his eyes and slept without a single nightmare. He slept like a man who had kept every promise that mattered and had finally found his way back home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.